So what if I told you that the most famous sentence in Western philosophy, the classic, I think, therefore I am, might actually be a 500-year-old cover song?
I mean, it is a wild concept to wrap your head around, right? Because it completely challenges how we categorize history.
Totally. When you think about the foundations of the modern world, you probably have a very specific map in your head. I know I did.
We all do. The human brain loves clean timelines.
Right. It's like a massive sprawling building, but with completely separate, hermetically sealed rooms. Over here in the West Wing, you have the scientific method, you have the European Renaissance, guys in wigs inventing modern philosophy.
Neatly siloed away from everything else.
Exactly. And then down the hall, in a totally different wing, you have the complex religious landscape of India. And maybe out in the courtyard, you have the social structures of Indonesia. We are taught to think of these as distinct, completely separate histories.
It is comforting to categorize history like that. It makes the narrative much easier to digest when we don't have to account for messy, cross-continental cross-pollination.
But what if those walls don't actually exist? Today's deep dive is going to completely shatter that siloed view. We have a massive, fascinating mission for you today.
We really do. We are taking a stack of historical texts and drawing incredibly heavily from excerpts of a specific source called A History of Muslim Philosophy.
And our goal here is to explore how a single massive intellectual bridge, which is Muslim thought, ignited the Western Enlightenment while simultaneously sparking a peaceful social revolution all across the East.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer, almost unfathomable scope of this transmission of knowledge.
It's massive, right?
Oh, absolutely. We are looking at a geographic and intellectual map that stretches from the translation hubs of 12th century Spain all the way to the Sufi mystics navigating the rivers of the Malay archipelago.
That is just a staggering amount of ground to cover.
It is, and we are going to focus rigorously on the mechanisms of this. Not just giving you a list of what was transmitted, but diving into why this transmission happened in the first place.
Right, and how it fundamentally rewired the cultural software of the world. Wait until you hear how the father of modern Western philosophy might have basically rewritten an Islamic autobiography. It is, well, it's just mind-blowing.
It really is an incredible piece of detective work. But to understand it, we really need to set the scene first.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the contrast between these worlds is just staggering. We're in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Right.
In the West, you have Charlemagne and his lords. And according to our sources, their intellectual pursuits mostly consisted of dabbling in the simple art of writing their own names.
Yeah, that is essentially the peak of the European Dark Ages.
Right. Meanwhile, over in the East, Muslim hubs like Baghdad are just thriving.
Thriving is almost an understatement. They possess the works of Aristotle, Plato, Hippocrates, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, plus all this Persian and Indian mathematics.
But here's the critical distinction I want to focus on, because the sources claim that the greatest thing Muslim thought gave the West wasn't just hoarding Greek books.
No, not at all.
It was a completely new way of interacting with the physical world, the scientific inductive method.
Yes, because the Greeks were, as the text explicitly describes them, pre-scientific.
Wait, hold on. We're taught the Greeks invented science, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Archimedes in the bathtub, Pythagoras and his triangles. How were they pre-scientific?
Well, the Greek temperament was incredibly theoretical. They loved to systematize, they loved to generalize.
Okay.
And they built these beautiful, abstract, theoretical frameworks based entirely on deduction.
Deductive reasoning. So that's top down, right?
Exactly. Deductive reasoning is top down. You start with a big premise, like all men are mortal, and deduce down to Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It relies almost entirely on the mind.
So it's like logic puzzles.
Basically.
Yeah.
But the inductive method, which is the patient accumulation of positive knowledge, the minute methods of science, detailed observation, experimental inquiry, all of that was largely alien to the Greek temperament.
Oh, wow.
They didn't want to get their hands dirty counting individual men to prove mortality rates, you know?
Oh. So, if the Greeks were the armchair philosophers doing thought experiments, the Muslim scholars were the ones who actually invented the laboratory.
That's a great way to put it. They were the ones putting on the metaphorical lab coats and actually measuring things.
Because they shifted the entire paradigm from top-down theorizing to bottom-up observation.
Exactly. Muslim thinkers harmonized faith with reason. They viewed the physical world as a text written by God that demanded active physical investigation.
Right. They couldn't just sit and think about it.
No. Take Muhammad bin Zakaria al-Razi, for example. He essentially founded the philosophy of nature in Islam. Or consider Ibn Haytham, who is known in the West as Al-Hazan.
Al-Hazan, right, the optics guy.
Yes, he didn't just read Aristotle's abstract views on light. He actually critiqued Aristotle specifically for his lack of induction.
He called him out.
He did. Ibn Haytham conducted grueling, detailed empirical research on optics. He analyzed light, perception, the refraction of rays, and the mathematical relationship between distance, position, and size.
So he was actually doing the math and running the experiments.
Exactly. He argued that true knowledge requires combining the intellect with the physical, measured content of experience. He was reconciling rationalism with empiricism centuries before Europe even knew those terms.
It's basically the difference between guessing how a clock works by looking at its face and actually taking it apart gear by gear.
That is a perfect analogy.
And the sources mention that this experimental method didn't just stay in Baghdad, it traveled. I was absolutely amazed to read the section about Roger Bacon.
Oh, yeah, Roger Bacon.
Because in the West, we are taught that Bacon is this great, lonely pioneer of the experimental method in 13th century England. Like he just figured it out by himself in a cold castle somewhere.
But according to scholars cited in our text, like Briffault, Roger Bacon was essentially an apostle of Muslim science to Christian Europe.
An apostle, so he was just spreading the word.
Basically, yeah. Bacon learned Arabic and Arabic science at the Oxford School, which had been heavily influenced by Jewish scholars following William of Normandy.
Oh,
Bacon himself never wearied of declaring that knowledge of Arabic science was the only path to true knowledge for his contemporaries.
he literally told everyone they needed to learn it from the Arabic texts.
Yes. He didn't invent the experimental method in a vacuum. He imported it.
Wow.
The very spirit of inquiry, measurement, and experimental observation that we consider the hallmark of the Western Renaissance was introduced to the European world by Arab scholars.
Which completely reframes the idea of how Europe got out of the Dark Ages. I mean, they didn't just wake up one day and decide to start doing science. They were handed the toolkit.
They absolutely were.
But if Muslim scholars gave the West the tools to measure the physical world, they also gave them the architectural blueprints for the spiritual world.
This is where we get into literature.
Right. Dante Alighieri, the Divine Comedy. This is taught everywhere as the lonely, isolated monument to the Middle Ages, the ultimate work of pure, singular Western European genius.
But the sources reveal it owes a massive, undeniable debt to Islamic texts.
A massive debt.
Specifically, the Miraj, which is the story of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension to heaven, and also the writings of the great Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi.
My jaw actually dropped when I read this section.
Yeah.
Because when the Spanish scholar Arsène Palacios began comparing these texts, he uncovered parallels that go far beyond vague thematic similarities.
Oh, they are incredibly specific.
It's practically a one-to-one architectural blueprint. Let's break down the structure of hell for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
In both Dante's Inferno and Ibn Arabi's descriptions, hell is a massive, funnel-shaped edifice. It has spiral staircases leading down to different stories, and in each story, a different class of sinners is housed.
And the mechanical physics of both hells are identical.
The physics, too.
Yes. In both versions, the weight of the sinners actually increases the further down they go, which symbolizes the gravity of their sins.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly specific.
It is. The first floor in Ibn Arabi's hell is an ocean of fire. This corresponds exactly to what Dante called the city of Dis, which is characterized by fire tombs.
Fire tombs, right.
Yeah. And in Islamic accounts, you have thieves, murderers, and gluttons tortured in incredibly specific chambers.
And Dante does the exact same thing.
Exactly. For example, the punishment of agonizing thirst given to counterfeiters in Dante's comedy perfectly mirrors the punishment for drunkards in the Islamic Miraj Nama.
And it doesn't even stop in hell. When they go up to heaven, it keeps going.
The parallels continue all the way up.
Right, so the prophet reaches a sphere and meets an angel who guides him to a group of nymphs surrounding a poet's sweetheart. And then, when Dante enters his earthly paradise, he's greeted by a fair maiden named Matilda who politely answers his questions.
The structure of the heavens is identical. Both heavens are built on the exact same astronomical model of Ptolemy.
Featuring 9 heavens corresponding to the signs of the zodiac, right?
Yes, and both works assign identical moral virtues to each specific sphere. But the staging of the guides is perhaps the most compelling evidence of all.
Right, the guides. Let's talk about Gabriel and Beatrice.
In the Islamic tradition, the angel Gabriel serves as the guide for the prophet. But as they approach the absolute blinding presence of God at the pinnacle of heaven, Gabriel is forced to step aside.
Because he can't handle the light.
Exactly. He cannot endure the divine light. Now look at Dante's climax. His beloved guide Beatrice does the exact same thing. She steps aside for St. Bernard when Dante approaches the ultimate divine light.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here because this is a massive claim.
It is a huge claim.
Could this just be a coincidence? I mean, couldn't two different cultures just imagine the afterlife in similar archetypal ways? Funnels going down into the earth for bad people, spheres going up into the sky for good people, the logical geometry for good and evil.
Right. That is a very common objection.
Because you don't necessarily need to read someone else's book to imagine that fire hurts and the sky is holy.
And Aston Palacios anticipated that exact pushback. If it were just geometric similarities, you could definitely argue for parallel evolution. But Palacios didn't just sit in a room comparing two books and guessing. He proved the transmission through actual historical detective work.
He found the paper trail.
He traced the actual physical movement of these specific Islamic texts into Christian Europe. These ideas were transmitted through key figures like the Spanish Dominican monk Raymond Martini and Raymond Lull.
Raymond Lull. Who was he again?
He lived in the 13th century and studied Arabic and Muslim philosophy extensively. Palacios proved that these specific Islamic manuscripts were translated, heavily debated, and circulating in the exact intellectual circles that Dante inhabited in Italy.
Oh, wow. So it's not just that the ideas are similar. It's that we have the receipts showing Dante's friends and colleagues were reading these exact books.
Exactly. The architectural and moral structures are just too identical, right down to the specific punishments for specific sins and the precise staging of the guides. It is a direct literary inheritance.
So the greatest poem of the Christian Middle Ages essentially has an Islamic skeleton.
It really does.
That alone changes how we should view European literature. But if Dante borrowed the poetry of faith, what about the rigorous, cold logic of faith and doubt?
Now we are getting into philosophy.
Right, because waiting for us here are two absolute titans of Western philosophy, Blaise Pascal and René Descartes.
This is where we see Islamic thought infiltrating the intellectual groundwater of Europe. Let's look at Pascal first, the 17th century French mathematician and philosopher.
Famous for Pascal's wager.
Exactly.
Anyone who has taken a Philosophy 101 class knows this. It's a betting argument. Pascal says, look, if you aren't sure about religion, you should just bet that God exists.
It's game theory.
Right. Because if you bet on God and you win, meaning God is real, your payout is infinity, eternal life.
And if you lose...
If you lose, meaning God isn't real, you lose nothing. You just die like everyone else. But if you bet against God and you're wrong, you get infinite punishment in hell.
It's a calculated, almost cynical, mathematical approach to faith.
It really is. But through meticulous textual analysis, scholars have shown that this exact betting argument was extensively elaborated by the Muslim theologian and philosopher Al-Ghazali.
Centuries before Pascal was even born.
And it wasn't just a vague similarity of ideas either, was it? The sources say Al-Ghazali used the exact same analogies.
He did. Pascal frames it as a game of chance. Al-Ghazali framed it identically. To explain the logic of risking a little for a greater, though doubtful, gain, Al-Ghazali used the practical examples of his day.
Like what kind of examples?
Hunting, commerce, taking a dangerous sea trip, or undergoing a surgical operation.
Right.
He pointed out that in all these human activities, a person calculates that the potential future gain is worth the immediate tangible risk. You risk your capital in commerce, hoping for a return. You risk the agonizing pain of medieval surgery, hoping for health.
So Al-Ghazali set up the scales.
Exactly. Weighing the finite, fleeting pleasures of this 70-year earthly lifespan against the infinite, limitless nature of eternity.
And didn't Pascal literally use the phrase, let us weigh the gain and the loss?
Yes, he did. Pascal's famous phrasing, pesons le gain et la perte, is a direct methodological echo of Al-Ghazali. But the sources argue that Al-Ghazali actually deployed the wager more effectively than Pascal did.
Wait, how so? If the math is exactly the same, how is Al-Ghazali's version better?
Because of the target audience and the psychological completeness of the argument.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Pascal was primarily addressing people who were already hesitating. He was talking to agnostics who lacked the positive arguments to reach a final decision about faith. He was basically giving them a nudge.
Like, hey, you might as well.
Exactly. But Al-Ghazali deployed his wager aggressively against hardcore atheists and freethinkers.
Oh, wow.
People who outright refuted the next world and considered religious dogma absolute nonsense.
So Pascal was selling municipal bonds to conservative investors, and Al-Ghazali was pitching high-risk venture capital to hostile skeptics.
That is a brilliant way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
Al-Ghazali used the argument ad hominem, turning their own logic of self-interest and expediency against them.
How did he do that without relying on hell?
He argued that even if you take God entirely out of the equation, even if the next world doesn't exist, living a virtuous life, controlling one's passions, and avoiding destructive vices yields true earthly happiness anyway.
So it's good for you right now.
Yes, it saves a person from the slavery of sensuality and greed. So Al-Ghazali argued that even in a purely secular, earthly sense, they lose nothing by betting on virtue.
It was a comprehensive, airtight argument that didn't just rely on the threat of hell, it relied on the promise of a better life here and now.
Exactly. It was structurally more complete than Pascal's.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because we move from Pascal to René Descartes, the guy who famously said, "I think, therefore I am."
The supposed father of modern philosophy.
Right. Descartes is held up as the definitive starting point of modern Western philosophy. The story goes that he wiped the slate clean, doubted everything in the universe, and built reality back up from his own consciousness.
That is the standard orthodox narrative of Western philosophy. But we need to look at the astonishing similarities between Descartes' discourse on the method, published in 1637, and Al-Ghazali's autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal.
Which translates to the deliverance from error, right?
Yeah.
Written over 500 years earlier.
Yes. The parallels are so exact, so structural, that the 19th century historian George Henry Luce remarked that if a translation of Al-Ghazali's work had existed in Descartes' time, everyone would have cried out against the plagiarism.
Wow. Okay, let's walk through these parallels step by step. Because how does a 12th century Islamic autobiography match a 17th century French philosophical treatise?
Well, they both begin as autobiographies starting from their youth, and both authors make the exact same sociological observation early on to justify their entire project.
Which is what?
They note that children of different faiths, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, simply follow the customs of their parents blindly.
Ah. They realize that belief is largely an accident of geography. Like, if I was born in Paris, I'm Catholic. If I'm born in Baghdad, I'm Muslim. Therefore, I can't trust what I've been taught.
Because of this realization, both men resolve to completely discard all tradition and authority. The process of radical doubt begins. Both of them systematically doubt the senses.
They realize their eyes and ears can lie to them.
Yes, and they use the exact same examples to demonstrate sensory deception, like how a straight stick looks bent when you put it in water.
That is so specific. And then they push it further, right? The classic Matrix scenario.
Having doubted tradition and the senses, both men push skepticism to its absolute extreme. They both decide to feign that waking life itself might just be a dream.
The dream argument.
They posit that the things we experience while awake might be no more real than the phantoms of our sleep, and that perhaps we only truly wake up to reality when we die.
So they both doubt tradition, they both doubt their eyes and ears, they both doubt if they are even awake. Then what happens?
Well, having reached the terrifying depths of this skepticism, a kind of existential crisis, both men withdraw from public life.
They isolate themselves.
They leave their prestigious places of work and wander in search of truth. Ultimately, both withdraw to quiet, isolated lands for solitary contemplation. Al-Ghazali flees to Damascus and later Nishapur. Descartes retreats to Holland.
And finally, in isolation, both devise the exact same method for discovering the truth.
Taking only that as true which is conceived so clearly and distinctly in the mind that there is zero possibility of doubt.
And for Descartes, this undeniable bedrock was, "I think, therefore I am."
And for Al-Ghazali, his starting formula was, "I will, therefore I am," ultimately finding his bedrock certainty in a sort of divine intuitive illumination.
So what does this all mean? If they are this identical, down to the specific sequence of their mental breakdown, the examples of the bent stick, the dream argument, the isolation, why isn't Al-Ghazali credited on the cover of Descartes' book?
That is the big question.
Did Descartes have a translated copy of Al-Ghazali's autobiography sitting on his desk while he wrote?
That is the great mystery of this transmission. There is no direct smoking gun proof that Descartes read a specific Latin translation of Al-Munqidh.
So it could be a coincidence.
Unlikely. You don't necessarily need a smoking gun when the atmosphere is filled with smoke. The
Uh,
overarching atmosphere of Muslim scholasticism had deeply permeated Descartes' education. Descartes was educated by the Jesuits at La Flèche.
and the Jesuits knew about these texts.
The Jesuits were intimately familiar with the philosophical debates of the Middle Ages, and those debates were entirely shaped by Muslim philosophers. Furthermore, other masterpieces of Al-Ghazali had been translated into Latin long before Descartes' time and had heavily influenced Jewish and Christian scholasticism.
So it's that intellectual groundwater idea again.
Precisely. Descartes himself refers cryptically in his work to the example of many fine intellects that had previously had this plan, but he names no one.
He just vaguely hints at it.
Yeah. Whether he read Al-Ghazali directly, had it summarized for him, or simply absorbed it from the intellectual ether of a Europe heavily influenced by Arabic thought, the conclusion is inescapable. The foundational framework of modern Western philosophy rests squarely on Islamic intellectual groundwork.
It's like Europe was drinking from this well for centuries without putting a label on the bottle.
Exactly.
But if Al-Ghazali provided the framework for doubt and faith, it was another Muslim thinker who provided the ultimate weapon against the church. If Al-Ghazali gave Europe the tools to defend faith, how did the very same Islamic intellectual ecosystem produce the spark for the anti-scholastic rebellion?
This brings us to one of the most controversial figures in medieval history, Ibn Rushd, who became famous in the Latin world as Averroes.
Averroes?
What is fascinating here is that Averroes became much more famous and influential in the Christian West than he did in the Muslim East. He was considered the greatest interpreter of Aristotle.
But he wasn't just a translator. The text makes it clear he was incredibly dangerous to the status quo. What made his version of Aristotle a threat?
To understand the threat, we really have to understand what earlier scholars had done to Aristotle. For centuries, thinkers had attached Neoplatonic ideas to Aristotle's work.
Okay, let's define Neoplatonism really quickly for the listener, because that sounds like heavy jargon. What does that actually mean?
Think of it as adding a thick layer of spiritual mysticism over cold, hard logic.
Okay.
Neoplatonism involves the idea that everything in the universe emanates from a single, mystical, divine source, sort of like light radiating from a sun.
So they were trying to soften Aristotle.
Yes. Earlier scholars used this mystical overlay to make Aristotle's rigorous logic compatible with religious ideas of a creator god and a spiritual universe. But Averroes came along and stripped all of that away.
They took away the mystical filter.
He presented a pure, highly rationalist, almost secularized Aristotle. And out of this, he introduced two ideas that were absolute dynamite for medieval Europe. First, the theory of two truths.
This one is brilliant. It's the idea that philosophy and religion are two totally separate paths to truth.
Yeah.
And they might even contradict each other on the surface, but both are valid in their own spheres.
Exactly. Averroes argued that a philosophical truth discovered through logic and observation doesn't invalidate a theological truth, and vice versa. They just operate on different frequencies.
So they don't have to fight.
Right. It essentially allowed philosophers and early scientists to study nature, logic, and physics without having to constantly warp their findings to fit perfectly into church dogma.
If you think about it, this is the exact same debate we have today
Yeah.
about teaching evolution versus creationism in schools.
It really is.
Averroes was basically creating a loophole. If you were a scientifically minded person in the Middle Ages being persecuted by the church, Averroes was your lifeline. You could shield yourself by saying, hey, the Bible is true in the realm of theology, but I'm operating over here in the realm of philosophy. My science doesn't threaten your religion.
It was an ingenious defense mechanism, but his second explosive idea couldn't be easily hidden behind that shield.
Which was what?
The concept of the eternity and potentiality of matter.
Which goes directly against Genesis.
Completely. The Orthodox Christian and Islamic view was creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. The belief that God snapped his fingers at a specific moment in time and the universe sprang into existence from absolute void.
And what did Averroes say?
Averroes argued that matter itself is eternal, it has always existed, and it contains the potential to produce all forms from within itself.
So if Averroes is saying matter is eternal, he's basically cornering the church. He's stripping God of the creator title and making him more of a manager or a prime mover.
Yes, that takes away God's role as the instantaneous creator of the universe.
It sounds almost like the modern scientific conservation of mass. Like matter cannot be created or destroyed.
Which is exactly why the church panicked. It was intellectual dynamite. This pure rationalism ran like wildfire through European schools.
People were eating it up.
Oh, absolutely. The scientifically minded people in the West found in these theses their best support against religious orthodoxy. The church saw Averroism as a direct existential menace to Christianity.
So what do they do?
The Council of Paris forbade the teaching of his commentaries in 1210, and the bans were frantically renewed by popes and bishops in 1215, 1231, 1245, and 1277. They specifically condemned prominent followers of his, like Sigurd of Brabant.
But you can't ban an idea once it's out in the wild.
You cannot. The ideas simply went underground or shifted locations. Universities like Bologna and Padua became, as the text explicitly calls them, hotbeds of Averroism.
So the universities were protecting the ideas.
Yes. For centuries, from the end of the 12th to the end of the 16th century, Averroism remained the dominant school of thought in these radical intellectual circles.
Wow.
It directly fueled the anti-scholastic movement, it broke the monopoly of church dogma on intellectual life, and it actively mechanically paved the way for the secular rationalism of the Renaissance.
Okay, we've seen how Muslim thought shocked the West out of the Dark Ages, handed them scientific method, gave Dante his blueprint, gave Descartes his philosophy, and fueled the Renaissance through Averroes.
It is a massive legacy in the West alone.
It is. But if these ideas were powerful enough to break the intellectual monopoly of the Catholic Church in the West, what happens when this ideological force moves east?
That is where the story shifts dramatically.
Because the sources show that the impact in the East was less about intellectual philosophy and profoundly more about social and cultural revolution.
To understand the eastward expansion, we have to start with Persia, and we really have to look at how a religion interacts with pre-existing social structures.
The sources tell this famous story about the Prophet Muhammad sending a letter to the Persian monarch, Khusrau Parviz, inviting him to Islam.
Yes, Khusrau.
Khusrau, being the arrogant ruler of a massive ancient Sassanid empire, just tears the letter up and kicks the messenger out. Muhammad prophesies the downfall of Khusrau's empire, and within a decade, the Muslim forces absolutely crush the Persian army.
It was a shocking defeat.
But here's the thing. Military defeat is one thing. You can conquer a land, but assimilation is another. Why did the Persian masses embrace this new religion so quickly and so completely?
Because it wasn't just a theological shift, it was a desperate social liberation.
Social liberation from what?
To understand why, you have to look at the oppressive reality of pre-Islamic Persia. The Sassanid Empire was tottering under the crushing weight of a despotism supported by a very rigid religious hierarchy.
Which was Zoroastrianism.
Yes. Zoroastrianism was the state religion, and its priests held enormous temporal power. And they had created a system that fundamentally degraded the working classes.
How exactly did they degrade them? Because we usually think of ancient empires as just having slaves and masters. How was this different?
It was tied directly to their theology. In Zoroastrianism, the natural elements fire, earth, and water are intensely sacred.
Okay.
The priests decreed that the working classes, artisans, mechanics, laborers, agriculturists, defiled these sacred elements simply by doing their jobs.
Well, let me make sure I understand this. If you are a blacksmith, you have to use fire to make tools, but fire is sacred. So by doing your job, you are spiritually polluting the holy fire.
Precisely. If you are a farmer, you are digging into the sacred earth, polluting it. Because of this theological framework, their trades were considered inherently impure.
That is brutal.
The laboring classes in Zoroastrian society lived a miserable existence, treated with absolute contempt, very similar to the untouchable castes and other rigid social hierarchies.
So they were perpetually sinning just by surviving.
Yes, and on top of this spiritual degradation, there were heavy taxes and constant religious persecutions of minorities like Christians, Jews, and Buddhists.
So when Islam arrives, it's not just a guy with a sword saying, "Pray to my God." It's an entirely new social contract.
Islam offered a classless society. It explicitly recognized no distinctions of caste or occupation. It decreed that a person's worth was based entirely on merit and piety, not their profession.
For the Zoroastrian masses, this was a massive psychological and social panacea.
Oh, absolutely. Suddenly, a blacksmith or a farmer had the exact same spiritual dignity as a king.
And there was more religious tolerance too, right?
Furthermore, Islam offered tremendous religious tolerance to the non-Muslims. Christians and Jews were protected as people of the book, And the prophet specifically directed that Zoroastrians be treated with the exact same fairness.
And there was a tax component too, right? The poll tax. Usually taxes are a burden, but the text frames this as a relief.
Yes, the jizya, or nominal poll tax, was required of non-Muslims, but it was a massive relief because paying it exempted non-Muslims from military service.
Oh, so they didn't have to fight.
Exactly. The previous regimes heavily conscripted the lower classes into brutal wars. Now, they could pay a small tax and be left alone to live in peace. And if they chose to serve in the military, they didn't even have to pay the tax.
So the average Persian found physical, economic, and profound social relief in the new system. They didn't convert because they were forced to. They converted because the new system actually treated them like human beings.
That makes total sense. Oppressed people will always embrace a system that grants them dignity.
But then the text brings up a historical mind-bender that completely flips the scripts on how conquests usually work. Let's talk about Genghis Khan and the Mongols.
The Mongol invasion in the 13th century is regarded as one of the greatest calamities to ever befall the Muslim world. It was an apocalyptic event.
They just destroyed everything.
Genghis Khan and his successors swept over Central Asia, Persia, and Iraq like a cyclone. They destroyed ancient seats of learning, they burned the great libraries of Baghdad, and they completely obliterated the political structure of the Islamic Empire. They ruled over the ashes of millions.
This is what I don't get.
Yeah.
Usually the conquerors force their religion on the conquered, especially when they completely devastate them militarily. I mean, when the Spanish conquered the Americas, they brought Catholicism. What happened here?
What happened is a profound historical anomaly that shows the resilience of ideological systems. The Mongols practiced a primitive form of shamanism, deifying forces of nature, relying on magic, totems, and incantations. When they established their kingdom on the ruins of the Muslim Empire, they found themselves ruling over a society that, although militarily defeated, was highly sophisticated, civilized, and intellectually advanced.
They encountered a massive administrative apparatus, complex philosophy, and a cohesive social structure.
And ultimately, the conquerors were culturally conquered.
So the people holding the swords looked around, realized the people they just conquered had a better operating system for running a civilization, and decided to adopt it.
Exactly. The organized religion of Islam, with its rich philosophy, egalitarian social structure, and administrative history, proved to be an irresistible ideological force.
Oh, wow.
Over time, the Mongol kings and their elites eventually converted to Islam.
That is wild. But there is an irony here, right? Because the Mongols destroying the empire actually ended up spreading the religion further.
That is the great paradox of this era. By converting the Mongol conquerors, Islam gained a massive new vehicle for expansion.
Because the Mongols controlled so much territory.
Yes. The Mongols carried their new faith back through their vast empire, further into Turkestan, Siberia, and Russia areas that the original Arab and Persian armies might never have reached.
The military destruction of the Islamic center catalyzed its expansion into the deep periphery.
It really did.
So we've seen how Islam dismantled the caste system in Persia and absorbed the Mongol conquerors. But this theme of ideological collision and synthesis reaches its absolute peak when we look further east.
Hurry, look at India.
Right. When Islam collides with one of the world's oldest, most entrenched, and most complex social structures, India.
When Islam met Hinduism on the Indian subcontinent, it was an ideological earthquake. You have two vastly different, deeply entrenched worldviews coming into direct, prolonged contact.
And Islam brought what the sources call a militant democracy.
Right. Strict, uncompromising monotheism and a fundamental belief in the universal brotherhood of mankind.
And that was a direct threat to the Hindu social order at the time.
It posed a fundamental challenge to the caste system, which strictly compartmentalized human worth based on birth, and the polytheism that characterized the Hindu society of that era.
I think a lot of people view religions as these static blocks of stone that just sit next to each other on a map, occasionally bumping into each other but never changing shape.
But that's not how it works in reality.
No, because the text shows that Hindu philosophy actually changed structurally post-contact.
It did, quite significantly. When two massive cultural ecosystems meet, they force adaptations in each other.
Give me an example of that.
The sources point out that before the Islamic arrival, certain ancient schools of Indian philosophy, specifically the Nyaya and Vaisesika systems, were originally atheistic and atomistic.
Let's translate that. Atheistic and atomistic meaning what?
It means they believed the universe was made up of eternal, immutable atoms that combine and separated based on natural laws or karma.
Okay.
And they didn't rely on a supreme creator god to explain the mechanics of the universe. They were highly analytical, almost materialistic frameworks.
But then they changed.
Yes. After the 9th century, following significant cultural and philosophical contact with Muslim thinkers who were bringing robust, logical arguments for monotheism, these Hindu systems took a distinctly theistic turn.
They realized they needed a better philosophical counterargument.
Yes. Thinkers like Udayana in the 10th century began formulating formal, logical proofs for the existence of God, which is something that hadn't been a primary focus of those specific schools before.
So they adapted.
They adapted their philosophy so that the immutable atoms now required a presiding, intelligent God to regulate their activities. It was a philosophical shift driven by the pressure of a new ideological competitor.
But the philosophical shift at the top is one thing. The social impact on the ground was even more visible, right? I'm looking at the Bhakti movement. Ramanuja is a great example of this synthesis.
Ramanuja in the 11th century is a pivotal figure. He advocated the worship of God with intense devotion and faith, which is the core of the Bhakti movement. But crucially, he recognized love as the guiding principle not just between man and God, but between man and man. Because of this, he argued that man-made barriers like caste should be discarded in the realm of worship.
So he took the egalitarian idea of Islam and applied it within a Hindu framework. He actually threw the temple doors open to the lower castes and the Sudras, which was revolutionary.
It was absolutely unprecedented. Furthermore, his intense emphasis on self-surrender to God and the absolute adoration of the spiritual guide, what is called Guru Bhakti, strongly paralleled the practices of the Sufi mystics who were migrating into India at the time in large numbers.
Let's talk about the Sufis, because they keep popping up as the primary engine for this cultural exchange. The Sufis were these wandering Muslim mystics, deeply spiritual, living simply. They weren't soldiers.
Exactly. They were not conquerors. They were preachers, ascetics, and examples of a different way of life. They lived among the poorest classes, totally disregarding caste.
And this cross-pollination reaches its most beautiful expression with figures like Kabir in the 15th century.
Kabir is fascinating. He was a weaver.
A weaver, a man of the working class. He spent considerable time in the company of Sufis. He vehemently hated caste distinctions.
And he rejected the authority of the traditional 6 schools of Indian philosophy, and he even poo-pooed the deeply held theories of transmigration and reincarnation.
So what did he actually believe then?
His central theme was that God is light and can be approached through ecstatic devotion regardless of your birth.
Which sounds very Sufi.
These are ideas heavily indebted to Sufi thought. But Kabir wasn't trying to just make Hindus into Muslims. He was trying to evolve a new spiritual path acceptable to both, stripping away the dogmatic rituals of both orthodoxies to find a common egalitarian core.
And then, following right after him, building on that exact foundation, we have Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism.
Guru Nanak is perhaps the most profound example of this vast ideological synthesis. The sources argue that his principles were unmistakably influenced by Islamic ideology. He launched a campaign for absolute monotheism and righteous living. He fiercely condemned polytheism, idol worship, and most importantly, caste distinctions.
So Sikhism is essentially born out of this collision between Hindu tradition and Islamic egalitarianism.
Yes. His ethics were life-affirming and practical, not based on monastic renunciation. He emphasized submission to the will of God and obedience to a guru.
So he's pulling from both sides.
In his insistence on the unity and brotherhood of mankind, the text argues, he was promoting principles that were fundamental to Islam, creating a distinct, powerful new faith that bridged the gap between the two cultures.
It shows that cultures don't just exist in bubbles. The religious landscape of modern India, with its incredible diversity, its Sikh population, its massive Muslim population, and its modified Hindu traditions, is a direct result of this massive ideological cross-pollination.
The walls between the rooms in our imaginary historical building have completely dissolved.
And if India represents a complex ideological synthesis, the furthest reaches of the East Indonesia represent a totally different kind of cultural revolution, a revolution that brings us back to the power of social safety nets.
Indonesia is such a vital piece of this puzzle.
Because today, it has the largest Muslim population in the world, and yet it is thousands of miles removed from the Middle East. It was never conquered by Arab armies. So how did it happen?
Great question.
The common story you hear, and this is what I was taught, is the merchant myth. Muslim merchants from India or Arabia sailed over looking for spices. They traded, they married local women, they got rich, they bought influence with the local kings, and basically assimilated the local power structures. It was just good business.
Simple, right?
Simple, appealing, but according to our sources, highly inaccurate.
Really?
Scholars cited in the text, specifically Nieuwenhuis and Van Leur, completely debunk this merchant theory. They point out a very logical flaw.
Foreign trade and foreign merchants were by no means new or alien to Indonesian society. Hindus and Buddhists had been trading there, intermarrying and generating wealth for 1,000 years without converting the entire archipelago.
Oh, that makes sense.
Trade alone and a few rich merchants does not explain a mass, grassroots religious conversion of millions of people across thousands of islands.
So if it wasn't the spice trade, what was the real catalyst? How do you convert an entire archipelago without an army?
The real catalyst was ideological, social, and spiritual. And to understand the mechanism of how it worked, we must look at what Islam was replacing.
Okay, what was the situation there?
Before Islam, much of Indonesia, particularly Java, was ruled by the Majapahit Hindu dynasty. Over centuries, they had instituted a process of Hinduization, which included importing and enforcing a caste system just as rigid as the one in India.
And as we saw in Persia with the Zoroastrians, the people at the bottom of a caste system are the ones suffering the most. A caste system is basically a pyramid scheme of human worth.
Absolutely. It divided the society into watertight compartments. The non-priestly classes, particularly the lower ones, suffered immense social indignities and ruthless economic exploitation.
And superstitions played a big part too, right?
Yes. They were hemmed in by countless superstitions. They were forced to pay constant homage to a multitude of deities and local spirits out of fear of disaster or disease, and their lives were entirely controlled by a hereditary priestly class that extracted wealth from them.
So into this highly stratified, superstitious, deeply oppressive environment steps Islam.
And it steps in not with armies, but with a radical idea: absolute equality.
Right.
Islam presented a creed where there are no distinctions dividing man from man, where a person born in the lowest, dirtiest class has the exact same spiritual worth as a king. When they pray, they stand shoulder to shoulder.
To the oppressed Indonesian masses, embracing Islam wasn't just a change of theology. It was a way to reassert their fundamental dignity as human beings. It was a way to acquire democratic rights and live free from artificial man-made restrictions. It was, at its core, a social revolution masquerading as a religious conversion.
That is exactly what the sources argue.
But who were the people actually spreading this message? Because if the rich merchants weren't doing it, who was doing the groundwork?
The vanguard of this movement were, once again, the Sufi mystics. Men like Maulana Malik Ibrahim and Maulana Burhan al-Din.
The Sufis again.
These were scholars, physicians, and deeply pious men who migrated to these islands. They didn't just preach from afar or hang out in the royal courts. They got their hands dirty, they learned the local dialects, they cured the sick.
The text mentions they built mosques, but these weren't just places to go pray on Fridays, were they? We have to look at the mechanism of how a mosque functions in a society that has no social safety net.
That is the key. They functioned as vital community centers. The converts congregated there to discuss their daily problems and difficulties.
So it was a hub.
It was a place of social cohesion, mutual aid, and education. If someone was sick or starving, the community at the mosque helped them. And the Sufis were brilliant at cultural translation.
This is the part I found most fascinating. How they basically rewrote the cultural software of the islands. Tell us about the literature.
The Sufis looked at the existing Indonesian literature, which the sources describe as highly esoteric, deeply superstitious, and designed merely to humor the princely class and reinforce the caste system.
It was stories about gods and kings that told the peasants to stay in their place.
Precisely. The Sufis replaced it with healthy, moral literature that appealed to the common man. They translated Persian works like the Mathnali of Rumi and the Mantiq Altair of Attar.
And these included animal fables, right? Why animal fables? How does an animal fable dismantle a caste system?
It is a brilliant pedagogical tool. They introduced stories where the principal characters were birds and animals. In a fable, a tiger and a mouse can converse. A bird can outsmart a lion.
Oh, I see.
This subtly subverts the rigid caste idea that a king and a peasant cannot interact. or that the strong are inherently superior to the weak.
That is so clever.
These fables taught effort, struggle, and egalitarian community living, rather than life negation or passive submission to a hereditary caste. It modeled social mobility and moral agency for people who had been told they had none.
So they basically used ancient Persian Disney movies to teach democracy to the Indonesian working class.
That is a very modern way to put it, but yes.
It wasn't a conquest by the sword. It was a conquest by community and storytelling. They didn't just bring a theology. They brought a social safety net that the caste system had completely denied the people.
Exactly. They provided a new anchor. When a convert left their rigid caste or clan, they were absorbed into the Ummah, the universal egalitarian community of Islam, which provided a sense of belonging that transcended local geography.
So you weren't alone anymore.
Right. It was the simplicity of the creed, stripped of theological complexities, combined with this massive, tangible social uplift that won the archipelago.
Okay, we need to synthesize this incredible journey because we have covered thousands of miles and hundreds of years. We started by looking at a map with separate, siloed rooms.
The West did science, the East did mysticism.
But what we found is a massive interconnected nervous system of ideas that spans the entire globe. From preserving and advancing the inductive scientific method that allowed Roger Bacon and others to spark the Renaissance in Europe, to providing the architectural inspiration for Dante's masterpiece, to laying the exact intellectual groundwork for Descartes' philosophy of doubt.
It's all connected.
And then sweeping east, dismantling oppressive caste systems in Persia, sparking theistic shifts in Hindu philosophy, inspiring the founders of Sikhism, and leading a peaceful, egalitarian social revolution across the thousands of islands of Indonesia using community centers and animal fables.
It is truly breathtaking in its scope.
Muslim philosophy and theology were the uncredited architects of much of the modern world's intellectual and social framework.
It forces a profound reevaluation of history. It proves that isolation is a myth, and that human progress is always the result of synthesis. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, drawing on a figure mentioned briefly in our sources, Ibn Khaldun.
Okay, who was he?
He lived in the 14th century and is widely recognized today by many modern scholars as the true father of sociology and the first philosopher of history.
Sociology. We usually think of that as a 19th century invention. Marx, Weber, Durkheim.
Yeah.
How was the guy in the 1300s doing sociology?
Before Ibn Khaldun, history was largely recorded as a series of theological events dictated by God, or just a dry list of the idealized actions of kings.
Right.
Ibn Khaldun was the first to explicitly assert that human societies should be studied as natural phenomena. He looked at the rise and fall of empires, the dynamics of nomadic versus urban life, and economic cycles, applying a rational, empirical, almost inductive lens to human group behavior.
He looked for the underlying mechanics of society.
He was looking for the gears of the clock, just like Ibn Haytham did with optics. This revolutionary idea, the very birth of the social sciences, sprang from this exact same Islamic intellectual melting pot. It predated Western sociology by centuries.
That is just incredible.
So I invite you to consider this. When you look at the way you analyze the world today, whether you are trusting the scientific method, valuing philosophical skepticism, debating the separation of church and science, or analyzing society through sociology, how much of your modern worldview was actually born in the minds of medieval Muslim scholars?
That is a phenomenal question to end on. It brings us right back to those silos we talked about at the beginning. Once you see the bridges, you realize the walls were just an illusion all along. The modern world isn't a series of separate rooms. It's a house built on a shared, incredibly diverse foundation. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives you've been taught. Look for the hidden bridges, and we'll see you next time.